imagine not having all of your brain? Well, I do not have to. My name is Samuel Kitchen, and 90% of the back part of my brain, the cerebellum, controlling balance, fine motor skills, coordination, and some emotional regulation, is simply not there. Ironically, I am thus less big-brained than all of you. Yet, I am the one up here giving the TED Talk. You see, I have a condition called Dandy Walker syndrome, where that back part of my brain simply never formed. Even crazier, this disease is only one of my many, including ulcerative colitis, growth hormone deficiency, optic nerve hypoplasia, cyclic vomiting, and more. With all of these issues, it may seem as if I'm a miracle standing in front of you. And, in a way, I am. Still, what you may not understand by just hearing me rattle off these illnesses' names is that most of these problems do not hinder my daily activity. Really, Dandy Walker syndrome and ulcerative colitis are my only conditions causing regular struggles. Yet, the real miracle of my standing and talking to you today is the fact that I can speak so nonchalantly about issues that have caused me such real pain in my life. Truly vulnerable problems. And that is why this talk matters to you. Well, some might argue that I must have some innate resilience then. I believe that my ease of conversation relies much more on a perspective that anyone can have for themselves. First, I think that you ought to at least know what Dandy Walker and colitis are. Technically, the National Library of Medicine defines Dandy Walker syndrome as a, quote, rare congenital malformation of the central nervous system, characterized by underdevelopment or dysplasia of the cerebellar vermis, expansion of the fourth ventricle, and posterior fossa cister, unquote. But that is a word salad. So, I will translate as your local science nerd. Basically, Dandy Walker is where the back part of the brain does not develop normally or at all before birth. Unfortunately for me, there is no cure for this condition, making it chronic. The most common treatment available is where doctors place a drain, called a shunt, into the back fold of the brain to remove any excess cerebrospinal fluid, or brain water. That fluid buildup, called hydrocephalus, is one of the most common side effects of Dandy Walker syndrome. Likewise, ulcerative colitis has no proven cure, making it yet another chronic illness that I have. Essentially, colitis is a form of inflammatory bowel disease, or IBD, an acronym that you may have heard before. This autoimmune disease is where the body's own protection system attacks the large intestine and rectum until ulcers or bleeding forms. Symptoms such as drowsiness, diarrhea, and rectal bleeding can seem almost inevitable. Regardless, my ongoing story encompasses much more than the technicals of my diseases. Specifically, my narrative with Dandy Walker involves the emotions displayed by me in various hospital rooms throughout my life. My mother once wrote a precursor entry to a journal she gave me, detailing how she went in for a 20-week ultrasound with me. Despite the nurse's timid expression, my mother quickly became concerned about her unborn baby boy. The nurse would not tell Mom what was wrong, but she directed my parents to maternal fetal medicine, the unborn baby specialist, who diagnosed me with Dandy Walker malformation. The doctors then offered my mother an abortion, which she refused. Now, abortion is a hot topic, so I will not get into that. But I think that I can describe Dandy Walker's effects by telling you that there have been times in my own life when I have wished that my mother had aborted me, simply so I would not have to deal with the pain of my chronic illnesses, a thought that I am sure many with lifelong diseases have also had. Kind of like the song lyrics by Queen. I don't want to die. I sometimes wish I'd never been born at all. And yes, as a certified beer kid, I had to sing it. Truly, I was lucky with my dandy walker. As the condition had been spotted in utero, I had that shunt I was telling you about placed into my head at only 10 months old. A surgery that apparently had to be redone the next day because the shunt was not in the exact right place for my tiny brain the first time. Now, I continued to struggle with Dandy Walker, truly. And when I was 8 years old, we found that, unfortunately, my blissful ignorance could not last. In the first photos, I looked content and did not really know what Dandy Walker truly was. I did, but not to the extent I do now. In fact, I vaguely remember writing shunt as something for which I was grateful on one of those first grade Thanksgiving projects. But I definitely did not remember the pain of my condition, or the therapies that I had to have as a young child to ensure that I could be normal. And like I said, this blissful ignorance could not last, as at 8 years old, when I went in for a regular ophthalmology checkup, we found that the already small nerves at the back of my eyes, due to optic nerve hyperplasia, had swollen significantly. I had been experiencing strange vision problems, even going blind for a few seconds while getting off the school bus in 3rd grade. To my chagrin, the doctors confirmed my scary symptoms to be shunt failure. The drain at the back of my head had stopped working, which forced pressure onto my eyes, prompting messed up vision. I had not even known that my shunt could malfunction, and I was terrified. My mom rushed me to the emergency room, where I began to cry, with the frightening news that I would be having the first brain surgery in my memory. 7 more shunt revision surgeries would follow. In March 2020, New Year's Eve 2020, January 2021, 2 in March 2021, May 2021, and most recently in August 2024. With my growth from 8 years old to present, my shunt had been pulled out of place numerous times. The pain before each surgery was extreme. The doctor screwed a device into my skull called an intracranial pressure monitor that found that the normal force inside an adult human's head is about 14 to 18 millimeters of mercury. Mine varied anywhere from 80 to over 100 millimeters of mercury. Fluid literally squishing my brain from the inside. I was miserable for the majority of 2020 and 2021 because of this pain. The morphine in the hospital could not even touch it. Still, all I really knew about my condition, other than the basics, was that it was out of my control. That helplessness led to hopelessness, and the hopelessness crushed me. I wished that my brain could have squished just enough more when I was a baby so that I would not have the mental capacity to understand my helplessness. Then, I thought, I could truly have bliss through ignorance. So, I have to ask, how did I go from this misery to joy after many failed attempts at sticking with an IV before my last surgery? I was experiencing the same symptoms, headaches and vision problems that were bad enough that I could not finish my AP Chem homework, which, for me, meant that something was really wrong. You see, we know that ignorance is bliss was not at play here, because I am definitely not ignorant to the problems that my chronic illnesses, plural, can bring. My dandy walker still limits my fine motor skills, for example, so I have to go to occupational therapy and have college board accommodations. The struggle is interminable. Diagnosed at the end of 5th grade, 4 years before the youngest average age to be diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, I continue to struggle with the implications of IBD as well. For goodness sake, the lethargy from regular blood loss slowed down my process for this very talk significantly. So, once again, I ask, how did I go from this distraught perspective to me now? How can I get up here and discuss such sensitive, personal matters this forwardly? How do I not feel as hopeless when I am just as helpless in curing my diseases? Well, as a future scientist, I think that we ought to use some deductive reasoning and draw conclusions from what we observed. Clearly, we can rule out a stance of ignorance as the reason for my outlook shift, right? Because I'm definitely not ignorant, but am in fact well informed about my conditions. And that is actually where I believe our answer lies. You see, in these first photos, I looked content, even with my circumstances, because I was oblivious. Ignorance was bliss. Yet, unfortunately, life and the realities of my problems were inescapable. When I had not yet confronted my diagnoses, looking to understand them for myself, I felt helpless, as depicted in these second photos. What changed from then to the present was my education on my conditions. In 9th grade, we had to give an informational speech in my public speaking class, and I chose to talk about Dandy Walker syndrome. That project forced me to learn more about my condition and what I could do to alert the doctors when something was wrong. Even more recently, my parents and gastroenterologist encouraged me to look further into treatments for my ulcerative colitis. Now, I am on a biologic, an injected medicine that has helped me gain weight and improve. I am thus a huge proponent of the somewhat cliche phrase, knowledge is power, which, fun fact, originates from a Francis Bacon book, although it sounds as if it belongs in a Marvel film. On that note, I will share an analogy that my parents used to use with my younger siblings and me, claiming that we always have a choice, no matter what. That agency is the one thing of which no one can truly strip us. As little children do, we ask the dreaded what-ifs. What if you're drugged? What if you're tied up? What if someone is threatening your life? Do you still have a choice then? The answer was consistently yes. Imagine that you're a superhero. Humor me. Tied up in your enemy's lair, who has forced you to drink truth serum. You still have a choice on what to do next. But that is where knowledge being power comes back into play. You may have a choice, but that agency means nothing unless you have the education to know what to do with your choices, unless you remember that you can fight the truth serum to keep the villain from knowing the secrets and the coordinates the largest safe in the city, or that you have a way to contact your sidekick to let him know that you need help. Knowledge is power. Having your chronic illness seems a lot more like the second option in that hypothetical scenario. I am helpless, tied up, and unable to do any extracurriculars without a bathroom nearby. But I do have a choice. I had to learn how I could contact my sidekick nurses and doctors for help when I was helpless. Knowledge is power. That is the change that I deduce made it so I could have joy even through the pain of Dandy Walker disruptions and ulcerative colitis upsets. Knowledge is power. But for me, more importantly, knowledge is comfort. Comfort to know what in the world will happen next in my disease-ridden life, even if I cannot do anything about it. And to know what I can do to prepare for the coming trials myself, even if that course of action is severely limited. For other people with chronic disorders, a similar phenomenon has been recorded. The National Institute of Mental Health reports that people with chronic illnesses are at a greater risk for depression, but that treatments, including therapies informing their patients about their conditions, can improve people's moods. In a specific study, the APA even noted that women with breast cancer were more psychologically well-adjusted 3 years after diagnosis when they confronted that diagnosis by learning about it. These women felt less hopeless about their cancer by curtailing their helplessness with education. Knowledge was their comfort. Nonetheless, I am aware that I am 1 in every 25 to 35,000 people with Dandy Walker syndrome and 1 in every 250 with colitis in North America. But this message applies to each of you without chronic illnesses as well. Political polarization, for example, is a problem that 86% of American adults agree is present today. Plus, if this large percentage of adults believe that our current politics are worrisome, imagine how us youth feel helpless in that we cannot vote. Like me, with my chronic illnesses and doctors, relying on adults to fix our problems for us. Yet, the youth civics education in the US is at an all-time low despite the fact that quote-unquote extant research suggests knowledge from this education can be our comfort. Quote, increasing young people's social capital, political knowledge, and even political participation, unquote. Evidently, knowledge, with its catalyst to action, can be our comfort in our unprecedented political environment and otherwise. So, I think we have answered the question of how my talking today is a miracle. I can get up here and joke about my painful, touchy experiences. I can address topics like chronic illness and politics, not because I have some congenital courage that came along with my congenital birth defect, but because I, like you, can alleviate the hopelessness that stems from helplessness by learning the ins and outs of our problems, seeking knowledge as comfort, and boy are we blessed to live in a time and place when and where knowledge is generally available in a country where freedom of information is deemed essential. So we must not lay complicit to our own individual and societal issues while seeking ignorance and bliss. Instead, we should seize the power of the knowledge readily available to us and seek assurance in that information, taking advantage of the truth that knowledge is comfort. Thank you.